I want to begin with a small story about a potato, or rather the misunderstanding of one. You might think that the dispute between Canada and the United States over potato shipments was merely another minor irritant in the long list of trade scuffles that occasionally punctuate the life of two neighbors bound by geography, commerce, and habit. But what actually unfolded reveals something far deeper about how political theatrics collide with the quiet, relentless logic of integrated supply chains. The headlines told you that Donald Trump imposed tariffs and that Canada responded. What the headlines did not tell you, and what I want to walk you through, is how this moment exposed the fragility of economic nationalism when it encounters modern interdependence. You saw the story, but you did not see the machinery beneath it, the machinery that actually determines outcomes in a global economy. The official storyline is deceptively simple. The United States announced a 25% tariff on Canadian potato products, lumping them into a broader set of measures meant to project leverage. Canada, instead of bending, restricted exports from Prince Edward Island to the United States, citing both disease-related protocols and the new economic reality created by the tariff. Almost immediately, markets reacted. Prices shifted, shipments slowed, and suddenly a starchy agricultural commodity became a surrogate battlefield for competing visions of trade policy. For you as a consumer or a voter, it might have seemed distant, perhaps even trivial. Yet the mechanisms at play here have everything to do with how much you pay at a restaurant, whether your region attracts investment, and whether political decisions are made with an understanding of the institutions that actually hold an economy together. To understand how we arrived here, you have to look at the decades-long integration of North American agriculture. Farmers on Prince Edward Island do not simply harvest potatoes. They participate in an intricate system involving processing facilities, cold storage networks, transportation corridors, and multi-year contracts with American buyers whose businesses depend on stable, predictable supply. That stability is not an abstraction. It is the difference between a functioning food service industry and a volatile one. When politics collide with that structure, as they did in this case, the results ripple far beyond the fields where those potatoes are grown. What might feel to you like a distant policy dispute becomes, in very practical ways, a matter of institutional competence or its absence. The mechanics behind the tariff's impact were straightforward but relentless. A tariff at that scale instantly changes cost structures. Canadian exporters could not simply absorb the added expense without severely harming their margins. American processors could not suddenly conjure alternative suppliers who could deliver the same volume, quality, and consistency. And so you had a classic mismatch between political intent and economic capacity. Policymakers issued commands, but the physical systems that sustained trade answered with their own constraints. Markets, in their unsentimental way, punished the mismatch. Prices rose, inventories tightened, and contracts wobbled. All of this, you might recall, occurred while consumers continued showing up at grocery stores and restaurants, expecting the familiar reliability of a system they rarely see and almost never question. As we peel back these layers, a pattern emerges. The central actors were not only presidents and ministers, but also inspectors, port authorities, farm cooperatives, logistics planners, and processors. Each made decisions according to rules, incentives, and institutional norms that long predated partisan rhetoric. These are the often invisible custodians of economic order. They do not perform on campaign stages. They do not trade in slogans. They trade in continuity. And in this case, continuity was precisely what the tariff disrupted. The United States sought to exert pressure, assuming that economic dependency ran one way. But Canada, armed with diversified markets and institutional discipline, revealed that interdependence is never as simple as it appears from a podium. For you as a citizen, the lesson is that political assertions of dominance often falter when they collide with the actual architecture of cross-border trade. As this situation unfolded, the deeper question was not whether Canada would retaliate in kind, but whether it would respond strategically, and it did. What I want you to notice is that Canada did not behave as a reactive actor stumbling through a crisis. It behaved as a nation that had long prepared for the possibility that its largest trading partner might use access as leverage. By curtailing shipments to the United States rather than flooding the market and absorbing the financial blow, Canadian producers held their ground. You might imagine this required only political will, but it actually required something far more sophisticated, an internal agricultural system capable of weathering disruption without collapsing under its own weight. When you invest in infrastructure, diversification, and long-term contracts, you give yourself the capacity to choose rather than merely endure. That is what Canada demonstrated. When a country like Canada pivots toward Asia, it does so not out of romantic globalism, but out of cold institutional calculation. Markets in China, Japan, and South Korea have expanding middle classes. They have growing demand for processed foods, including frozen potatoes, and they often value the consistency and quality control that Canadian producers built across generations. For you as a viewer trying to piece together what matters here, the key is that diversification is not merely an economic tactic. It is a form of political insulation. It reduces vulnerability to abrupt policy swings by any one partner. It means that when a tariff arises, producers and policymakers can adjust rather than panic. It creates a degree of leverage that is quiet but profound. Inside Canada's domestic system, a different set of mechanisms activated. Government programs stabilized farm incomes not by distorting markets, but by smoothing volatility. Processing companies accelerated investment in automation and data analytics to maintain competitiveness even as supply chains realigned. Sustainability initiatives reduced operational inefficiencies. Each of these steps might seem removed from the flurry of political statements that accompanied the tariff dispute, but together they form the backbone of Canada's resilience. When a country can continue to operate efficiently even as external conditions shift, it signals that the real strength lies not in the drama of negotiation, but in the preparation undertaken long before negotiations begin. Meanwhile, the United States confronted the uncomfortable reality that a tariff does not magically create domestic capacity. You, as a consumer, or as someone who cares about stable institutions, understand the frustration of hearing policymakers declare that supply will simply adjust itself. But farms cannot expand overnight. Processing plants cannot appear on demand. Quality control systems take years to develop. The tariff forced American firms to reckon with a truth that had been easy to overlook when trade flowed smoothly. Dependence is not inherently a weakness, but ignoring it is. When supply chains are treated as political props rather than complex institutions, the public pays the price through higher costs and reduced reliability. Lobbyists and industry groups in the United States soon recognized the problem. They pressed policymakers to reconsider the approach not out of ideological fervor, but out of operational necessity. Their businesses depended on stable inputs, predictable logistics, and international partners whose incentives aligned with coherence rather than confrontation. What the tariff exposed was not simply a disagreement with Canada, but a structural vulnerability in the American agricultural sector. When a nation relies heavily on a partner, yet simultaneously undermines that relationship without building alternatives, it creates instability that cascades through the economy in ways the public rarely sees until it lands on their receipts. As the pressures mounted on both sides of the border, what struck me most was how the public conversation in the United States often misread the nature of leverage. There is a common political temptation to imagine that the loudest actor is the strongest actor, that the one announcing tariffs or drawing rhetorical lines automatically possesses the upper hand. But you and I know that real leverage arises from alternatives. It arises from preparation, from the quiet but essential labor of building systems that function even when political winds shift. Canada's decision to redirect shipments, sign long-term contracts in Asia, and shield its growers through domestic support mechanisms revealed that leverage is not volume, but adaptability. When a nation can choose new routes, new buyers, and new strategies Without unraveling its economic fabric, it becomes remarkably difficult to coerce. Prince Edward Island's farmers became an unexpected illustration of this truth. These growers had endured disease outbreaks, environmental challenges, and market fluctuations long before this tariff dispute. Their practices were shaped by those experiences. They developed efficiency not as an abstract ideal, but as a matter of survival. They built networks with processors, transportation firms, and international buyers. They cultivated a reputation for reliability. So when the policy climate shifted, they adjusted rather than succumbed. For you as a citizen watching events that can feel distant or bureaucratic, this may seem minor, but consider that institutions, formal or informal, are nothing more than habits built over time. And PEI's agricultural habits proved stronger than the political shock aimed at them. The United States, by contrast, found itself confronting the unintended consequences of policy meant to signal strength. The tariff revealed just how integrated North American food supply chains have become. Frozen fries that you might casually order at a restaurant rely on highly coordinated networks stretching across borders, climate zones, and regulatory systems. When that network is disrupted by sudden political action, the result is not simply a shift in trade statistics. It is a granular, daily distortion of business operations. Restaurants face shortages. Distributors scramble for substitutes. Pricing models fall apart. And all of this occurs while the broader economy still depends on consumer confidence and predictable markets. For you, as someone who lives within these systems, even if you rarely think about them, this level of disruption often registers as something as simple as a higher bill or fewer choices. Canada's strategy, executed with discipline rather than theatrical flair, demonstrated that political intimidation falters when it confronts a partner prepared to act methodically. The United States attempted to project dominance, but the tariff exposed its dependency on inputs it could not easily replace. The mismatch between rhetoric and reality created a vacuum in which costs climbed and institutions strained. And here is where the deeper lesson lies. Economies punish illusions. They reward preparation. They reward systems rooted in long-term thinking rather than momentary applause. If you have ever worked in an organization where sudden changes were imposed without understanding the underlying processes, you have felt a microcosm of this dynamic. At the same time, the dispute exposed a broader vulnerability in American economic policymaking. Tariffs, particularly when deployed quickly and publicly, often ignore the institutional memory embedded in supply chains. These systems evolve over decades, weaving together expectations, investments, and relationships. To disrupt them without building alternatives is to place immense pressure on every participant: farmers, processors, drivers, inspectors, and ultimately the public. Canada understood that pressure and moved to diffuse it. The United States created the pressure and then discovered it lacked the institutional scaffolding to absorb it. This imbalance did not have to occur, but once it did, the consequences were unavoidable. As the tariffs' effects became more visible, what emerged was a portrait of two nations responding from two very different institutional postures. Canada leaned on a coherent strategy grounded in diversification, predictable rules, and a willingness to absorb short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term resilience. The United States leaned on rhetoric meant to project power, but found that rhetoric alone cannot reshape the physical and economic realities of continental trade. You might expect, in a dispute like this, that the larger economy inevitably prevails. But power in international commerce is never measured by acreage or population alone. It is measured by how well each country has prepared for disruption, how broad its partnerships are, and whether its policies align with the structural facts that govern modern production. In this case, Canada's preparation gave it room to maneuver, while the United States discovered the limits of unilateral pressure. This is where the institutional story becomes especially important for you as a viewer. Democracies thrive when policies reflect an understanding of how systems function. They weaken when policies are enacted without that understanding. The tariff revealed a gap in American policymaking between intent and capacity. The intent was to pressure Canada. Yet the capacity to withstand the downstream consequences had not been built. No surge in domestic potato production followed. No rapid expansion of processing facilities materialized. Meanwhile, food service industries that operate on thin margins absorb the shock. Political decisions, when taken without corresponding institutional investment, frequently generate this kind of imbalance. And as citizens, you and I inherit the results whether we realize it or not. The human dimension of this dispute, often overshadowed by macroeconomic analysis, matters as well. Canadian farmers faced the anxiety of reorienting export patterns under tight timelines, even if government programs softened the immediate blow. American processors worried about supply shortfalls that could jeopardize jobs, contracts, and long-term competitiveness. Workers across both countries, drivers, factory employees, quality inspectors, seasonal laborers, found themselves drawn into a conflict they had no hand in creating. When we discuss trade policy, it is tempting to imagine only countries negotiating with each other. But in reality, it is families, small businesses, and entire communities who experience the consequences most directly. And in this case, those consequences stem not from the natural volatility of markets, but from decisions made without a full appreciation for the institutional ecology on which those markets depend. If you consider how deeply food supply chains are woven into civic life, you begin to see why this episode resonates beyond agriculture. A nation's ability to feed itself affordably depends not only on domestic production, but on relationships with trusted partners. Likewise, a nation's international credibility rests on its willingness to engage in trade with consistency and predictability. When a major trading partner deploys tariffs suddenly, even for strategic reasons, it sends a signal about reliability. Canada responded by strengthening ties with Asia, signaling that it would not anchor its agricultural future to a partner whose policies had grown unpredictable. This reorientation carries long-term implications that you, as someone concerned about democratic stability and economic well-being, cannot afford to overlook. Once relationships shift, they rarely snap back into place. What we saw then was not merely a disagreement over potatoes, but a clash between short-term political theater and long-term economic stewardship. Canada approached the conflict as a management problem, how to maintain stability, protect workers, and secure future markets. The United States approached it as a confrontation to be won, but confrontations in trade are not the way debates are won. They are resolved through the functioning of systems that punish inefficiency and reward foresight. If you have ever watched a leader insist on a strategy that ignores the facts known to everyone doing the real work, you understand the frustration that many American industries felt as this tariff unfolded. They were left to solve a problem created not by market trends, but by political bravado. As the dispute matured into its later stages, the broader structural lessons became impossible to ignore. You and I live in an era when political narratives often prize boldness over comprehension, speed over deliberation, and symbolic action over institutional literacy. Yet the world itself does not bend to symbolism. It bends to preparation, to expertise, and to the slow work of building systems that can absorb shocks without unraveling. Canada's strategy during this conflict showed what it looks like when a nation grounds its decisions in the realities of interdependence. It recognized that trade is not a poker game, but an ecosystem, and ecosystems do not respond well to sudden disruptions. They respond to balance, diversity, and continuity. These are not glamorous concepts, but they define whether a country can navigate international turbulence with confidence rather than fear. The United States, for its part, confronted the institutional consequences of pursuing leverage without fully accounting for the networks that sustain its own prosperity. Tariffs can be tools, but like any tool, they require understanding. A hammer does not become more effective because one swings it harder. It becomes effective when one understands what one is trying to build, what surface one is striking, and what structure lies behind it. When policymakers treat complex supply chains as bargaining chips rather than intricate systems of mutual benefit, They risk fracturing not only diplomatic relationships, but domestic stability itself. You, as a participant in this democracy, deserve policy shaped by comprehension rather than assumption. What this case ultimately revealed is something deeper about the nature of modern economic power. Power today belongs to those who can adapt without losing coherence. It belongs to those who can cultivate new partnerships, manage risk, and invest in the institutions that keep markets functioning. Canada's pivot to Asia was not a flourish meant to score political points. It was a deliberate act of strategic insurance. By developing alternative markets, Canada made clear that it would not be held hostage to political volatility. That is not defiance for its own sake. It is the quiet, disciplined posture of a nation that understands how global systems actually behave. And it forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable truth. In a world defined by shared supply chains, coercion without capacity is not strength, it is exposure. The human impact remains the most grounding reminder of what is at stake. Farmers on both sides of the border woke up each morning not to political abstractions, but to real decisions about bills, contracts, labor, and harvests. Their lives are shaped by whether governments choose stability or spectacle. Workers in processing plants, transportation hubs, and food service industries felt the consequences through shortened shifts, delayed orders, or rising wholesale costs. For many of them, this conflict was not a philosophical exercise. It was the difference between predictability and anxiety. And you, watching from your community, felt the ripples in small but telling ways: a higher grocery bill, a leaner menu, a sense that the systems you rely on may be more fragile than you assumed. So what does this all tell us about the health of our institutions? It reminds us that systems built on interdependence require leaders who recognize interdependence as a strength rather than an inconvenience. It asks us to reflect on the gap between political language and structural reality, a gap that widens when policymakers mistake headlines for strategy. And it invites you to consider how democracies thrive not by isolating themselves, but by cultivating relationships that distribute risk, reward competence, and reinforce stability. Canada showed that preparedness can turn a potential crisis into a manageable challenge. The United States showed that unexamined assumptions can transform a symbolic gesture into a costly miscalculation. As we close this discussion, I want to leave you with a simple thought. Trade conflicts are rarely about the commodities named in the headlines. They are about the fragility or resilience of the systems that move those commodities, the people who depend on them, and the choices nations make about how to wield influence. Canada responded to pressure with strategy. The United States responded with a tariff that revealed its own structural vulnerability. And somewhere in that contrast lies a lesson for all of us about the kind of political culture we hope to sustain. Do we want one built on performance or one built on understanding? You have a voice in that choice, and your awareness is part of what strengthens the institutions we all rely on. If you found this exploration valuable, I hope you will stay engaged, reflect on how these issues shape your civic life, and continue thinking with me about the forces that shape our democracy, our economy, and our shared future.